Well, and good morning. I'm Dave Renz. I feel like I know everybody here, and so I didn't introduce myself, but if you don't know who I am, I'm Dave Renz, Director of the Midwest Center and facilitator for this morning's session. Want to flag for folks that, this is session 3. You will also notice, you probably did notice in Mark Culver's information connecting you to this week's session, that the Midwest Center has now launched a YouTube channel, and we've taken things that were in our archives at the website and also positioned them, excuse me, in this YouTube channel. And so you may want to check that out. It's mostly recordings of the sessions we've done in the navigation series, but not entirely. There are some other resources and materials there, and we keep adding to them every week. So today we're talking about keeping folks in the game, specifically board members, of course, and how we engage them. But I want to flag that next week we will have in a sense, a different kind of governance conversation. It's not about the work or structure or organization of governance. We're shifting back to a creative community conversation category where it is a somewhat different format. We did a community conversation session a month ago or so, and that was just a no topic at all discussion. And some folks logged in, some folks said they weren't interested. You just have to judge, of course. But next week we will have a somewhat more focused session, and we're exploring a slightly different structure to the session. We thought, well, what do you think it'd be like if we started off with topically defined, and the topic, by the way, for next week is how is it going and what are the challenges and insights that you're gaining as you resume operations, you and your colleagues in your agencies resume operations in this transition stage of the month and a little beyond. So we have a focused, facilitated dialogue session. We want to keep conversations going, but we'll start with breakout rooms. Have a good share of the time with breakout room. One of our Midwest Center team members will be facilitating in each of those breakout rooms, and then after about 35 minutes in breakout rooms, we'll come together in a full group session to share across the rooms and compare what kinds of themes came up and what the interests are. So next week, 8:30, of course, is the usual time for the navigation series, and we encourage you to sign up for that. It is an open conversation. The theme is defined, but what we have in the way of content is everything that you will share along the way. So now today, good to see you and glad to have you here. We're talking about board member engagement. I'm going to invite you to just reflect for a second or two on what does it mean to be engaged. I did a workshop once where similar kind of a topic, but the name we gave to that workshop for this conference was, are you a board member or a board member? But I can't resist those lines. The staff tells me to stop it, but So we're going to talk, though, it's interesting. We have a lot of research that we don't connect to boards very often, and I think it's a problem that I'm going to try to remedy to a slight degree today. We have a lot of research on teams and what makes teams effective and how teams and their members can work together to achieve the impact they want. We need to apply that, in my opinion, to boards. We also have a substantial body of knowledge about volunteers, and yet we don't think about or talk about board members as volunteers as often as I think we should, including specifically what motivates and engages volunteers, what disenchants them, what kinds of things are going on. And so I'll be connecting a little bit from the research in those areas, as well as some other of the research and information that's here. I'll talk a little bit about board design and its implications for engagement. Of course, when you talk about engaged board members, how could you not talk about meetings, bloody meetings? I mean, meetings. And so we'll be talking about how meeting structure has an impact and do a little bit of conversation about the work of the chair as it crosses all of these things as well. And we'll conclude with about 20 minutes of asking you to share your insights and observations. Today, we will not be using breakout sessions. We'll be just doing that in full group. And I would encourage you again, post if you have questions and comments. certainly use the chat function and flag that. Cindy and Monica are monitoring the chats, and they'll interrupt me or add things in, or we'll draw on people's comments. So please don't hesitate to bring things up during the session as well. Now today I'll make mention of a couple of things during the session here that I think you may be curious to look at. One in particular in the category of meetings is a resource, an e-resource produced by BoardSource on actually one of their consultants on great meetings. And so there is a resource page in the box that does have about 5 different resources, and there are hot links to a couple of them, including particularly the item, which I think is actually, it's a nice succinct item called The Best Board Meeting I Ever Attended, written by a guy named Les Wallace. So let's get going and just kind of kick this off right off the bat. You know, we're talking about keeping board members engaged, but I'm just curious to get a reaction for a minute. You know, I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but just unmute yourself for a minute and tell us, when you think of a board member who's engaged, what is the basis for judging that? What does that look like to you? And by the way, a little Zoom cue here. If you want to say something for just a second, you can press the space bar on your, if you're on a computer, a laptop, or a desktop, and just speak. Dave, you're going to share a thought?
Sure. It varies from board member to board member about engagement. I always like to try and find out what they're interested in and how they want to help the organization and be supportive of myself and the staff. And so I have a conversation with the board members to see what level of engagement. Okay. Some are very active in trying to help out with, say, you know, fundraising or seeking connections. Others are real good with the governance and trying to figure that out. I have a new board president this summer, and we've had some great discussions, and one of the things she is doing is she's speaking to all the board members just to gauge how to stay connected with them through this COVID-19 mess, pandemic. So it's just, you just got to talk to people is what we have found, and keep them engaged that way. And then they also have a commitment. Our folks are committed to financially giving money, gifting money to Arts Tech. So we have lots of different ways to get them engaged, but my job is to always find how to keep them engaged.
Well, and that's the critical issue, you know, how to, and what I'm hearing you say, which I really appreciate, I doubt like many of the things we talk about in these sessions, it's not that people don't know more or less what we're talking about or referring to, but the insight is then, well, okay, it reminds us we need to think about that. And so, you know, it's a relationship. Being a board member is a relationship. Anybody else have an observation about how you judge whether somebody's engaged at the level you desire?
I think I'll share that I've got a more introverted board member who, at first I was having a really hard time figuring out whether or not she was engaged. And then I realized that her form of engagement is outside of the boardroom. She sends me content that she thinks is useful, resources that we could be using. It's just not in a large group dynamic. So she doesn't necessarily get involved in the conversation, but she's thinking about it. She's listening, she's thinking about it, and then she loops back with me, usually within the week.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's an interesting thought. You know, when we're teaching, we're trying to have engaged conversations all the time. And one of the things I had to learn a little bit in the way that you just described, Nicole, is that, you know, sometimes you've got dialogue going back and forth. Other times the conversation is actually happening in their head. And if the conversation is going on, I've learned that that's actually a good thing, even if they're not necessarily interacting with us. Now, if you don't ever see them at some point, that sort of gets confusing too. But what do we see on the chat? Monica or Cindy, what do the chatters say here? So Ian Boyd says sometimes there's complaining after board meetings about the board meetings, and that's certainly true. One of my observations is that one of the most important metrics you can judge about board meeting effectiveness is to calculate the amount of time people spend in the parking lot after the meeting speaking over the trunk of their car about how the meeting went. And my warning to folks is if the ratio of parking lot time to meeting time is about 1-to-1, an hour in the lot after an hour in the meeting, you may want to rethink how you're organizing the meeting and whether or not it's meeting their needs very well. Candidly, we do hear, and this gets at something, both of you brought it up, but it's also relevant to some things you'll hear in a couple of minutes. The number of board members who are disenchanted because they say, I go to these meetings, but I know there are critical things that could eat the lunch of the agency. It could knock us off our pedestal, but we're not talking about those. And meanwhile, we're talking about other stuff, or we're not getting to anything. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute, but it's a significant kind of an issue to think about, and I appreciate you flagging those things. So let's just talk about, as I mentioned a minute ago, we have a lot of research on what it takes to be effective and to grow effectiveness in teams, and yet we often don't think about it that way. I've had a couple of people actually push back when I've asserted that organizations should be teams, or I should say organizations, but boards should act as teams. But I've had some people say, no, we should just be a group. We don't have to work together. It's kind of like, well, I'm not sure I like that idea. I mean, what's the difference between a group and a team? To me, the difference is a team is a group that is working together to achieve a shared outcome, and they hold each other accountable and both support and hold each other accountable for getting it done. And I sure like to think that that would be a reasonable description of a nonprofit board. One of the things I think about, and I invite people to just think about this when you're weighing what you might be assessing, if you're diagnosing engagement and involvement, things like that, is the work of two of the leading researchers I use a lot in my courses and workshops are from Katzenbach and Smith, who've written, they've got a book called The Wisdom of Teams. There's an article at Harvard Business Review called The Discipline of Teams. Their model is reflected by the little triangle that you see on the screen in front of you. And specifically what they're saying is to have a high performance team, we need to have clarity around, and you get commitment from the purpose, the approach that is shared. In other words, we know how we're going to be doing things and we're working together to make that happen. We have specific goals. On the skill, and I would put knowledge if I were creating that thing, but knowledge and skills, we need to have people who bring capacity with both problem solving, technical, and interpersonal skills, some blend of those things. And yet I'm not sure that we often think about whether we're bringing people to the room. I will say, I'm not going to talk about it much here, but I probably should say it right now. I think the first step toward growing an engaged board member starts when you're recruiting the board member. And especially when we're talking about clarity around the roles and expectations and everything else that is associated with the organization and the board, that has a huge impact on whether they're engaged and whether they perform well. And then at the same time, one of the things that Katzenbach and Smith add that I don't see in some of the other areas, some of the other work on teams, is the dimension of accountability. And is there any accountability? I know many of you on this call, and so I know you wouldn't agree with the assertion, but I do hear the assertion in the community, oh, well, they're volunteers, we can't hold them accountable. You know what? You can't not hold them accountable. And it turns out it has an impact on engagement. Nobody cares, there's no accountability, no sense of feedback or anything like that. That undermines board member engagement. It undermines all engagement with all team members. So thinking about that is significant. Katzenbach and Smith argue that, and this is why they called their article The Discipline of Teams, groups become teams because they become more disciplined. And so I believe this is a suggestion, recommendation for our board work as well. We have clarity around a common purpose. We agree on performance goals for the group. Being clear about what do we expect. Maybe it's not, as Dave Sullivan was alluding to a minute ago, maybe it's, well, Nicole was too, it's not the same thing for everybody. But by the way, there are things that do have to be the same for everybody, or else it doesn't feel equitable. So what are the expectations? What are the performance goals? But for the group as a whole, is there any sense that we actually need to be effective as a team called the governing board of, you know, this organization or that? The reference to defining a common working approach is really clarifying and helping people know what are the norms and expectations for how I participate as a member of this group. And I have to tell you that I see this overlooked so often. It's kind of like you just get everybody together in the room and you immediately launch into whatever the content of the meeting is supposed to be, and it gets disrupted by all of this side chatter and all the other things that take you off course or maybe keep you from getting on course. We need to have agreements for how we work together. And so the reference to a common working approach is to help people know more fully what to expect as I join the team, the group, the board, and what is it that you know, is appropriate, for example, in the way of conflict. You know, how can I argue in a fair and appropriate way with you if I disagree? We all know we need conflict in the boardroom if it's constructive and on point. So how do we do those things? And the norms and dimensions of group process are really critical, and they really undermine engagement. And let me just say that, and I'm not talking only about racial or ethnic diversity here, but any kind of diversity, the more diversity you bring to your board, heaven knows we need to improve diversity on our boards, but what we need to improve is not just diversity. It's got to be turned into engagement and inclusion. Well, the more diverse the group of people we bring together, the less they have a shared reference point, a set of norms and expectations for, well, how do things work here? And most people hang back. They don't engage until they can figure out what is it that's going on. I've seen a few boards, by the way, say, well, you know, join the board and then you just be quiet for the first year or two. You'll get the hang of it, and then you can participate more actively. That is both legally and ethically a very indefensible position. You cannot defend that. From the day you join a board as a member of a governing board, you are on the hook legally. I believe ethically, everybody should be working to engage everybody else. And so it's a group kind of a thing. And that includes then the point of the group holding themselves mutually accountable, starting with when people miss meetings or things like that. And by the way, here's the thing, you can do it in a low-key way that's not offensive. You can call up a friend who was supposed to be at a board meeting and say, hey, I'm sorry you missed that. Let me catch you up on this. And frankly, orientations, the orientation process, I should say, an onboarding process that often is being used more carefully and thoughtfully than it used to be, regularly includes an element of a buddy or a mentor kind of a relationship. And in the early days, a lot of boards tried this, but they said, hey, Joanne, your mentor is Steve, and you know, call him if you've got questions. That doesn't work. We need proactive mentoring and buddying in the board. And so what you do is make sure that whoever is the mentor calls up Steve, Joanne after the meeting and says, hey, let's talk about the meeting. Are the things that confused you? Are you wondering why, so-and-so always looks grumpy? She looks that way all the time, or he looks that way all the time, but whatever it is. And of course, when you've got acronyms and other things that can derail the conversation, that can be an issue as well. But this engagement, I will tell you candidly, a lot of board members tell me they're not engaged because they don't think anybody even notices whether they're there or not. And so it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I think the organization's good, but who cares if I'm there? We need to make sure that people do feel like we care if they're there.
Dave,
yes.
Matthew Hughes kind of weighed in on this topic, and he shared something that they're doing in their organization. They sort of divided the board. I would imagine it from what he says, they've sort of divided it in quarters, the board members, and they have quarterly check-ins with them on.
Excellent.
how they're doing, and they ask them, you know, how the organization's doing, and then also how they're doing as far as their board agreement that they've, you know, so kind of evaluating their own work. And it's intended to kind of check in, but also to increase that ownership of the board. So another way besides the mentorship.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Cindy.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a nice connection in a way to, there is research, including there's a very interesting article on the motivations of board members as volunteers. It's one of the articles that's listed in that little resource page that I posted, or that Mark posted in the box. One of the highlights I want to bring your attention to with this slide, though, I realize there are a lot of words on the slide, but it's, you know, the top 10 reasons that people join boards, and this is specifically nonprofit boards. This is research done a few years ago in Georgia. And then you'll notice that there's a different list that says, why do they stay? And that's one of the things that I think is particularly significant to understand, that the criteria people use to judge whether they want to join a board are not exactly the same as those that they assess when they're thinking about whether to engage, whether to stay. The number one criterion that people pay attention to, as you can see on the list, 2 lists, is the same. It's they want to be there to help the nonprofit be successful. They help your organization be successful. When they're joining, they're looking at criteria like, well, I'm coming in, I want to be helpful to others, I want to contribute to society. If you look at the reasons why they stay, you'll actually notice that, you know, that broad, I want to contribute to society, that drops down on the list. It's still on the top 10. But it's interesting to see that it's less important over time. What they want to do, and what really drives board members' interests as time goes on, is that they become more invested in the mission and work of the organization and the needs of the clients. And so they're really focused on client needs. And frankly, you know, one of the things that shifts up the list, you'll notice number 7 on a reason to join is loyalty and respect for the organization. Well, over time, that actually becomes a motivator, or here's the warning. Are people experiencing these things? Because if they don't feel as though it's possible to be of service to the clients, if they don't retain their respect for the organization, things like that, it's really, it's an issue. Now, by the way, one of the things that you'll see doesn't show up on the second list here, it's on the reasons they join. Well, they join to learn more about the cause, that stays on the list, but opportunity for personal growth. People will join for that, but that's actually not as high a priority for people after they get into the game. They're much more about the organization. So, you know, I'm delighted to hear some of the examples you've already shared, because it highlights the point that if, to be effective and keep people engaged or get people engaged, you know, we need to know what is it that brings them in, and then what keeps them. In general, the volunteer research is very clear about something that I think is striking in regard to boards. Volunteers are motivated to stay and continue to give. And of course, volunteers that are not on boards can often walk away faster and sooner, but this is a critical distinction in both settings. They're motivated by their ability to do what is called on them to do well, and to do it in surroundings that are compatible. Now, of course, what they define as compatible probably varies. It certainly varies. But here are 4 critical situational factors that alienate volunteers and they leave. The first is suitable workload. Are you asking, you know, is the work you're asking of me, the demands on me, suitable in that sense? And ironically, I mean, candidly, I think you know this already, but if it's either too little or too much for that person, given their situation, their stage in life, all the other stuff going on, and of course, this is really relevant in this COVID time environment as well, but is the workload suitable enough that they're engaged but not overwhelming them? By the way, the competence of the volunteer supervisor is very significant in whether they stay or not. Well, who's the supervisor? Candidly, it should be, and it usually is, the board chair. But how's the board chair doing? I was actually pleased to hear in your examples that a couple of you have talked about, you know, board chairs actively taking a role in this. So often we end up with executives having to step in, but who is the leader of this team? It's the board chair. And if they're not doing their facilitation, I'll come back to talking about chairs in a minute, but if they're not doing facilitation work well, you know, this may be, not maybe, it's a demotivator. And when the demotivators get significant enough, it's an issue. The third of the key significant situational factors is that it's clear what your responsibilities are and what your accountability, the form and nature and extent of accountability is that you have. Now, of course, this ought to be starting when you're recruiting, when you're sharing, when you're doing your onboarding, and then following through with regard to actual work and life in the organization. But I have to tell you, I've had an awful lot of boards tell me that, yeah, they know they should have something more clear for their members explaining what it is we expect of you. And we're going to get to that, but we haven't got time. You know what? It reminds me of Stephen Covey's chapter in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The chapter is called Sharpening the Saw. The metaphor there is about education, but it's, you know, the apocryphal story is this guy comes across a logger in the North Woods. The guy's trying to cut down a tree. Clearly his saw is very, very dull and it's taking him forever. And so the sage observer says to the woodsman, well, you know, you could cut that a lot better if you'd sharpen the saw. To which the response was, well, I would, but I don't have time. Are you actually wasting time in the name of saving time? Maybe you don't have time to not do it. So give that thought. Last but not least is reasonable work schedule. And one of the things that's intriguing to me is that we really see all of these are influenced by generation, and millennials versus Gen X versus boomers and others. There are some variations, but there's a lot of it with regard to work schedule too, and flexibility. How much of your work do you demand be done on your timeline versus on the volunteer board members' timeline? If you're asking them to go out, reach out and contact people at certain times, you know, does that fit with their schedule? And, you know, maybe it's an hour-to-hour schedule because of the life cycles of their family, especially during COVID and recession and all the stuff that's going on now, but at any time. Also just, you know, individual life cycles. The prototypical example I heard from one of our colleagues was a guy who's an IT guy, and the organization needed to revamp its website, and he said, hey, I'd like to work on that. This isn't always a board member's responsibility, but in his case, they didn't have any staff. So he was going to work on the work site, but he said, you know, I like to work at 2 in the morning. And it's kind of like, well, why couldn't you work on a website at 2 in the morning? But the organization told him they didn't want him doing that. They wanted him to work on it during the day when they could talk to him, the supervisor, quote unquote, the board chair could talk to him at that time. Are you chasing away people just because of the inflexibility that comes with one form of schedule or another? And I think that really comes up in our variations in generations as well.
Dave, a couple comments on this area. So just the great importance of people, kind of the duty of care of people attending meetings and, you know, reading the meeting notes ahead of time, coming informed, listening to discussions, all that is just so critical to what the work the board actually does, and being able to make those types of informed decisions, the quality of the decisions that people are making. And then kind of in response to that, that meetings nowadays are being recorded somewhat, and a new dimension to reading meeting notes is the fact that you can go back and view the meeting now. You can watch it and kind of stay connected in a different way than that human-centered, that human connection that you don't get from just reading notes. So taking it a step further there.
Yeah, good points, and thank you for that. One of the technology-based options available to more boards now, there's a cost associated with it, but more boards are using them and they're getting more versatile, are board portals, you know, dedicated websites for board members, that you make sure you've got all of the resource materials you have there. And you can, increasingly, those portals are being used in the Zoom era as a place where the recordings of meetings that you were just talking about are placed, so people can go back and check in if they had to miss a meeting. Other resource materials, minutes, things of that sort can be there in a confidential, password protected space. And it does make the information available when people are there, but of course we have to put the resources there to do it. There are several board portals now that have really ramped up their advertising and marketing in this pandemic era, because they know people are meeting remotely. So how do we support that? So these motivators to participate fully, you've talked about some of them. The thing I want to really underscore, and it's part of the accountability, but it's the combination of motivation and accountability, is board members participate when they feel they're effective. So to be effective, you need to know, what is it you expect of me? And then, how am I doing? And not in big dramatic ways, but just low key feedback, and letting people know where they stand. But that means clarity of expectations, the opportunity to participate. And meetings are really a critical issue as well. We're going to talk about meetings here in just a couple more minutes. Board design has an impact on engagement. The research has actually clarified several of these things. I'm not going to talk in depth about these, and I've already alluded to a couple of them, but let me be explicit about where they undermine engagement. Board size, when you have a board that is too large, people start, there's, the psychological phenomenon is the diffusion of responsibility. It's kind of like, well, there are 25 or there are 40 of us. By the way, there are a fair number of boards in town that are 40 or 35, 40, 45 people. You don't feel like, you're a significant contributor in many of those cases, unless you push your way to the top of the line, but that sort of leaves other people out. And it just doesn't feel like it matters if you're there or not. I actually worked with one board about 15 years ago. The board had 60 members. It was kind of like a club, but it was a substantial volunteer organization. But the average member felt like, well, nobody's going to notice if I, one of 60, don't make the meeting. Well, by the way, believe it or not, many of their meetings, as part of why I heard from them, ended up with 40 of the 60 not showing up for the meetings. They didn't have a quorum. By the way, quorum is actually one of those critical issues with a good share of American boards. Slightly more than half of boards, particularly the volunteer boards, have problems with even making legally valid decisions because they don't have a quorum. But board size, the bigger it is, the more it undermines engagement, because it feels to people like, I can't get airtime, I don't, there's not time for me to talk, I'm not going to have a chance to make a difference. That making a difference is a critical issue. Another key issue, and I've described it more broadly than maybe I should in the slide, the balance of work in the board versus work in the committees. Some boards put so much emphasis on committee work that it undermines board engagement. You need to have committees supporting board work and doing pre-work for boards, not replacing what the board should do. Where that really becomes a demotivator is when you have a strong executive committee. Because if you're on the executive committee, you feel like your vote counts, your attention is required. But everybody else feels like, oh, the executive committee is the real board around here. We don't have to pay attention. And so you end up with disengagement because they feel like it doesn't matter. Who cares whether I'm here or not? I've already highlighted clarity of roles, but it's a huge issue, both clarity and, to the extent it's necessary, training and other information to help people perform well with regard to the roles that they're attending. Now, Cindy had highlighted a couple of minutes ago about, attendance, doing your homework ahead of time, things like that. Setting norms and expectations as you're recruiting people, not dropping it on them after they've joined. It's kind of like, oh, by the way, you have to be here every meeting, or, increasing number of boards are actually saying you're off the board if you miss more than 25 or 30% of all meetings, without an excuse. What that qualifies is all over the map. But you know, putting those expectations there and then enforcing them is a critical issue. I can't tell you how many boards actually have in their bylaws that you're off the board if you miss more than 25 or 30% of the meetings, and yet they don't enforce it. So it's another one of those things kind of, yeah, well, nobody really cares. Of course, you know, one of the things everybody loves to gripe about is giving expectations and things like that. But clarity about that is important. Being active in the organization's activities. One of the things that's an interesting tactic that I'm seeing start to be used more is boards actually going to all their members, and this should be done by a governance committee or the board chair, and doing a pre-re-election affirmation statement. What does that mean? It's a statement that the board member signs before they're being nominated for a succeeding term, a next term, that says, I am still able to, I'm interested and able to participate, and I agree that I will, and then honor the expectations that are identified explicitly there. You know, how many times do people get reelected to terms, you know, succeeding terms? It's kind of like everybody's afraid to even bring it up. The value of the affirmation statement, by the way, it's useful to have somebody sign it, but you're not going to take them to court if they don't follow through. The issue is you're making them, you're creating a time, asking them to reflect on how it's gone, and then you're making them say, yeah, I can do this again. Now, you know, I mean, are they going to be correct? I don't know, you know, life throws us lots of stuff, but at least it enhances the potential for that engagement. And then, you know, I've alluded to the onboarding stuff. That's really significant from the beginning, clarity of what it is that should be done. The general dynamic of board chemistry, does this feel like a good place or does it feel like a toxic place? There are boards, of course, that just feel terribly toxic and people can't wait to get off of them. In fact, they often withdraw even while they're still members. There's a very thoughtful, it's a little old now, but it still applies quite well. There's a book on board chemistry. It's literally called Boardroom Chemistry, Getting Your Board to Govern as a Team, that was published a few years ago by Board Source. It too, its citation information is on that resource list that I have in the box. And then let's talk about meetings, because that's what we often love to hate. But what is a good meeting? Well, as a couple of you have already said, we have shared expectations for how the meeting will run. And part of it is everybody arrives ready for action. But you wouldn't believe the number of organizations that don't get around to actually sharing the information or background materials in advance. It does give people an excuse for not actually doing what it is that you know, we need them to do to prepare in advance. And by the way, sometimes people need training. Now, the little two-page article that I mentioned earlier on, you can download it from the Board Source site, is the best board meeting I ever attended. Some of the things that Les Wallace highlights there is that the best board meeting, and it wasn't one he was facilitating, that he ever attended, he said it was great because it had a very clear agenda. The agenda was specific about what action or what's the purpose of this being on the agenda. The agenda is strategically organized. He didn't mention this, but one of the things I like is if you have a strategic plan with specific goals that call for the board to check in and assess accountability, how about if you organize your agenda in terms of the goals of the plan, and committees weigh in when it is that they have something relevant to share with regard to that goal, as opposed to breaking it out by structure, like this committee reports and then that committee reports and the other committee reports. So many board members complain that their time is radically underutilized because other people are bloviating. By the way, I know, and you do too, that there are any number of people who actually are the ones who violate that by going on and on and on, and then they complain after the meeting that nobody kept the meeting going and efficiently organized. But this is where board chairs are so important. If you have a fair amount of activity that needs board approval, but it really does, it's not It's not controversial. It doesn't require discussion. Using a consent agenda is significant. This is particularly, I found this very useful as a government executive with my government boards, because the law said my board had to approve all of these contracts that were really just pro forma. So the consent agenda, if you're looking for information about that, let me know and we can share it. Thanks. We can post an information piece about it. But the consent agenda is where you take all the non-controversial topics, put them on a list, make sure you share information about all of them ahead of time, but then at the meeting, they're all approved as a set. The protection there is if even one board member says, no, something on that agenda is, we need to talk about it, then it gets pulled off the agenda. Now, I will say it's funny, some organizations have so little activity of that sort that they use consent agendas, but the only thing that ever shows up on it is the minutes from the last meeting, and you could just as well vote to move it directly. Using dashboards is a really important and useful way to try to make meetings more efficient in preparation for them and also in the actual meeting. And make sure that you're taking time to deal with exceptions, not just update after update after update. And the real critical thing, the bullet point here says, a substantial share of meeting time is allocated to strategic dialogue. What's the trade-off? You all know what it is. It's sitting there listening to committee after committee after committee report on stuff, and somebody's reading you what they already sent out in an advanced material. But by the way, if you know it's going to be read to you at the meeting, you're not going to read it when it comes out in advance. It's a chicken and egg kind of a thing, but you need to break that cycle sometimes. Ideally, every board meeting also has some element of board member development. Sometimes it's a highlight, a little story from agency impact, a client who is especially well served. Sometimes it's training them on something. It should include fundraising if your board has any fundraising obligations. You know, vary it up, change it a little bit from time to time. And here's something that very few people do. The last point on the slide is conclude with a collection of feedback from your members. By the way, this is true for every meeting. The people who advocate team performance improvement use this tactic too. After every meeting, you know, use a 3 or 4 question. You could do it online, you could do a piece of paper, whatever, but gather information to find out what was useful, what was not useful. Did we waste time? And if so, what was it that we did? That all, of course, takes us to the point, you're all going to be shocked to hear this, but in 2012, our colleagues Yvonne Harrison and Vic Murray did research that proved what, frankly, every board chair and executive director knew to begin with. Board chairs are influential on impact. But here's the thing. What they found is that facilitation style chairpersonship, is critical. When chairs show up thinking their job is to be, I mean, very few people describe it that way, but a dictator as opposed to a facilitator, it undermines board culture, it undermines board performance. And so, you know, go back to the things we've talked about here. Is your chair, or, you know, my job is to push you on this if you're a chair, are you serving as a leader and facilitator instead of handling all the content and taking over the decision-making work that the board should be engaged in? I've had chairs say to me, well, I have to do that because the board won't engage. But you know what? As long as you do that, the board won't engage. How about if you set up the decisions so that they involve people, they demand people be in connection with what it is that you're asking of them? So, and I just want to go back to a point I made a little earlier on. How do your board recruitment and selection activities actually affect engagement? Are you setting it up so people are coming in knowing what you need to do and agreeing explicitly that that's part of what they want to do? So now, you know, we've got a few minutes in the afternoon, in the rest of the session, and I'd really like, I'll leave this slide up for a couple of minutes so that you just take a look at it and think about it. I'd like to hear, Dave Sullivan already did a nice job about sharing a couple of things. Nicole made the point too, but what have you done that has enhanced engagement? And by the way, have you learned that something you thought would enhance engagement actually didn't work that way. Be great to share with your colleagues what did or didn't work. So
Dave, we've got a couple questions, Dave. So concerning like the face-to-face, we've done there's a lot of stuff going online and in meetings now, but is there, there's value in face-to-face. And sometimes if you only have a meeting every other month and it's an hour to an hour and a half, it just doesn't add up, and it's really hard to promote and create that team and thus the teamwork from it. So do you have any recommendations or thoughts on how to overcome that? Is there an optimal face-to-face meeting time that you recommend, and that kind of something like that?
Yeah, well, a group really does have sort of the tendency and encouragement to act like disconnected overseers if you only meet on rare occasions. I mean, there are boards of many very large organizations, excuse me, in the country and the region that meet quarterly. If that's the structure you need and it's appropriate, I mean, usually it's for very large organizations with large staffs that's the case. And so the board is focused on policy and accountability. And maybe that works, but if you're only going to meet in a formal group on a quarterly basis or something like that, and by the way, just have to say this, the worst horror stories in this region and around the country of board oversight where everybody on the board said, oh, we're doing a great job, nothing's going wrong here, and they all felt that way until the FBI or the Attorney General dropped in and said, by the way, let me say two things about this with regard to Kansas City. This was a classic example of this happening in the past because they've changed their practices now as Kansas City University of Medicine and Biosciences. When your executives and certain board members are being indicted, when the IRS is investigating you, preparing to fine your board members, this has gone off the rails. And candidly, the generation before, they've really cleaned this up. They're performing very well. Truth be told, full disclosure, they've engaged me to come in and do an assessment a couple of years ago. I was very impressed by how they are performing now. But, you had executives who just said, hey, we're taking care of everything. We don't need a board. It's just because the law's there. Well, it blew up on everybody and in very extreme ways. So create other ways to keep people connected. And, Dave Sullivan was talking at the very beginning of our session today about calling members, contacting members, keeping them in touch. I do think that the downside of an executive director doing that is that it undermines some of the connectedness among the board members with the chair and each other. So it's really, it's important that you keep people engaged in multiple ways. I actually find that Zoom meetings are reasonably good for engagement. Telephone meetings are less so because there are fewer stimuli, fewer forms of connection. And I have to tell you, it drives me nuts. I mean, I've worked in this hundreds of times myself, of course, but it drives me nuts when you've got a conference telephone call unit in the middle of the room. And it disrupts the meeting of all those who are in the room. It is more effective to have everybody coming in from the same form of medium. And phone conversations are not very effective for deliberative dialogue. I mean, if you've got an emergency decision, okay, yeah, you may need to do it. But use the right tools for the right purposes and find ways to share information and keep people connected. I think that's one of the things the board portals afford is they're a safe, private, confidentially protected space where you can ask board members to come in and connect. But the human link is critical. And so board members should be checking in. I mean, board chairs should be checking in. Maybe that's something the governance or nominating committee should also be engaged in. Each group has to decide how. But you can't have a team if you're not connected enough that you even would recognize each other on the street. So it's a great point, Cindy. Are there other thoughts?
There's another thought too. I mean, as far as using board terms, there's a question, a private message to me from someone who's looking at their bylaws and trying to reevaluate how that works, and especially with terms. And 3-year terms are a little too committal for some people. And so they're looking at something about having a 1-year term and then renewing for a 2-year term and renewing for a 3-year term as to build that engagement, that commitment to the organization, and wondering what your thoughts on that. Is there a downside to something like that? And how does that help?
That's an interesting thought. The idea of escalating the length of terms after they've been there a year and 2 years scares me, because candidly, I think that will blow up on you. Very few people in today's world want to be on a board for 9 or 12 years. It's too long. It feels like a life sentence. And candidly, the people who do kind of in that mode, they're just riding along. They're usually not contributing as well. The advice I have to folks about terms is the length of a term should be tied to the life cycle of a typical issue that the board needs to be paying attention to. And so, I mean, for example, I've actually seen a lot of associations that were exceptionally dysfunctional from a governance perspective. The executives and staff had all the power because their board members were elected for 1-year terms. They only met twice a year as an association board. And in fact, the average significant decision made by that board stretched out over 2 or 3 years. Well, so nobody ever was there long enough with the institutional knowledge to make a substantive decision about that kind of an issue. If they were there 2 years, they were only there a year, but this has been going on for 2 or 3 years. So what is the life cycle? Your agency, every agency is a little bit different. And so that's where we need to think about that. By the way, the research from Board Source, which is a convenient sample, but it's 7,000 organizations, so it's a big sample. The average term is 2 years, or second most common is 3-year terms, renewable 1 or 2 times. That's, to oversimplify it slightly, that's what Board Sources found most agencies report for what it is they're doing. 1 year seems to be quite short. Now, implicit in what you described, Cindy, might be the argument of, well, let's see if they're a good board member and then we can renew them for a longer term later. It's legally questionable, and it's generally not very functional to have classes of board members where some are more than others, however that more is. I mean, legally, you're all on the hook for the same degree of accountability if you're all members of the governing board. And so now the way I encourage people to figure out whether somebody is a good prospect for a board is by getting them involved in some way other than just putting them on the board for their initial interaction with you. And a lot of organizations are allowing non-board members to serve on committees, and that allows them to see, well, how does this person work with others? Do they play well with others? Do they have a heart for the mission of the organization? Do they follow through on what it is they say they're going to do? And so you don't appoint them until you're confident that they actually will be following through as a member of the board as well. But I think I have to say, administratively, I would find it very confusing to appoint somebody for 1 year and then somebody else, and then the next time you get renewed, it would be for 2 years. Maybe I misunderstood the strategy, but that sounds very confusing to me. Frankly, I've had some exposure to boards that had trouble keeping track of staggered terms, which is a good idea. It's good to have a certain share of the board members, like half going off, a third or a half going off each year. And so you've got that institutional knowledge of 2-year terms or 3-year terms, while also keeping some institutional knowledge and some turnover that is healthy. I mean, turnover is important. It's just not the only thing.
There's a bunch of I want to just sort of direct people to the comments because there's a bunch of stuff in there, and I'll just sort of highlight what's in there right now, but read them in more detail. So just some helpful hints people are giving. So telling board members why they were chosen, what about their skills, that, just being reinforcing there. Having a board photo taken and put it in a newsletter is just something out there to put pride in, and share who they are. A meditation that's done at the beginning of each board meeting by a different board member. So to kind of give the different personalities there, I imagine, of the different types of meditations and things like that, and just sort of bring everybody together and bring them into that space, take them out of the other space. And then also alternating, keeping aware of, I assume, the time people are spending, but 1 month is a board meeting, 1 month is a committee meeting. So they're still staying engaged, but in different ways. So there's stuff out there, just do check on that. Also, Dave, someone wanted to know about your thoughts on giving, that they're seeing out there, and they didn't expand on this too much, but they are seeing sort of an evolution of a personal gift to the board, to the organization by board members, and what your thoughts are on that, if you're seeing that out there too, and what your thoughts are on giving to the organization by board members.
Well, it's a subject that a lot of people a lot of board members get grumpy about and worry about, but politically, it's essential that every board member give to the organization if it's an organization that operates on philanthropic resources to any significant degree. By the way, there are a few organizations that don't, particularly in the healthcare world. The majority of the revenue is coming from third-party payer systems like Medicare, Medicaid, insurance, client or clinic revenues, things like that. But if philanthropy is a significant part, not necessarily even the majority, but a significant part of your revenue model, you should have board members all giving. There are organizations that undermine the capacity to bring diversity in because they ask, or mandate, I should say, too much in the way of money. I mean, there is an organization in town, I don't know if they still do, but they used to demand upon joining the board, you wrote them a check and then you did it every year for $5,000. Well, they claimed they were a community-based organization, but you and I both know that you're excluding a whole lot of people from being prospective board members if the fee for entry is $5,000. So, think about that from a larger perspective. So I think giving is important. Candidly, it's generally not considered defensible to just say, and even though I do hear it a lot, well, but I'm giving you my incredibly valuable time. If I were out there providing professional services, the value of the time I gave this organization last year would have been $10,000 or $5,000 or whatever. I get the ethic of that, and it should be respected in a sense, but it doesn't work that way. By the way, the only way the organization can claim that as an actual gift, under the way the laws are written right now, your 990 can only consider volunteer contribution of time as a contribution if you're in a regulated profession, which basically means you're either a physician or an attorney. So but I think we have to help make the case for it. To spring things on people is a problem. And so when you're recruiting and helping people understand what it is, I think that's a critical issue. And just, we need to help people. The problem, of course, is a lot of times, especially in small agencies, the executive director is so busy, they say, well, I haven't got time to do that. One study a colleague of mine did ask executive directors how actively they were training their executives or their board members to raise money, and the reaction from a lot of them was, are you kidding me? I haven't got my time to train them to get money. I need them to go get money. It's kind of like, well, but how's that working for you? People don't, and frankly, from an engagement perspective, people don't like to work on things that they feel incompetent to work on. So we need to help them feel some basic level of comfort with what it is we're asking of them. The comment that somebody made earlier on, by the way, I do want to acknowledge and celebrate that. It is really valuable as you're recruiting people to join the board to tell them why it is and what it is you think they bring to the board that will add value. That enhances engagement because it helps them understand why it is you want them there. And let's face it, almost none of us wants to be on a board simply because they need one more rear end and one more chair or one more, image on the Zoom's page today. It's not motivating. I mean, let's go back to basics of motivation and think about, meeting their needs. All right, well, we've gone a few minutes over, and I apologize for that. I thank you